Hi everyone and welcome to another video on the topic of psychoanalysis. In specific, today we will talk about the ego as an ununified entity. We'll talk about the hypothesis that the ego is not unified and the idea that this idea put forth first by Freud but then continued by Jung is essentially the foundation of all postmodern thought. Like, in order to think about this, let's just recap what we've sort of said about the ego so far. And if you haven't watched any videos on the ego that I published, then you should probably go back and look at some of them. I think there's a lot of valuable content on the ego, especially on the channel. We've looked at the ego in multiple ways. We've looked at the ego as a narrative body to be precise. Essentially hypothesizing that the ego attempts to create a stable and coherent structure. We've looked at the ego in its struggle to maintain the stability and the structure against the forces of the unconscious, especially the collective unconscious. And we've looked at the ego as the entity based on which we interact with reality. So the ego as essentially the repository of the fundamental assumptions that we have about reality and from which we sort of move into the world. Now, today I want to relativize, or I want to put into context everything that we've said in other videos. So the idea essentially that the ego struggles for coherence and put that in context again, highlighting that the fundamental achievement of psychoanalysis is that the ego is fundamentally not coherent, right? And the reason why I want to highlight this is because I think it may be misleading for those of you watching the video or engaging with the other videos that I recorded and that still have a background in Freudian psychoanalysis or psychology or psychoanalysis in general, whatever school, maybe Lacanian schools, thinking now, oh, well, Jung put forth that the ego is unified. How does that work? How is that even possible? That seems unintuitive, and it seems to be this ego psychology kind of view, right? In classical ego psychology, let's say the psychology that you were taught when in the DSM-5 or in the kind of psychiatry schools and the medical schools around the world, we see the notion put forth that the ego is treated as this sort of stable entity that we can simply work with in terms of, let's say, behavioral interventions to some extent, or to the extent that we do that, right? While the idea that psychoanalysis is unique for us, the hypothesis that there is actually something beyond the ego, right, an unconscious that actually goes beyond the ego. What I want to propose to you today is that this beyond is taken to another level in Jung on the first instance, but that Jung doesn't really draw a large difference between what Freud called the personal unconscious of the unconscious and Jung's shadow or Jung's personal unconscious, essentially. Okay, well, let's get straight into it. So the starting point for any of these notions is essentially the idea of the subject as the experiential entity of wholeness, right? Like, we think if we experience ourselves in our everyday lives, we experience ourselves in our mundane experience, we must say, as relatively stable, relatively whole, relatively, as we would say, continuous, right? Like, you think, essentially, if you think about yourself today and tomorrow, you think there is not a large difference, right? You're the same today as you are tomorrow, and you'll be the same roughly in a couple of days, right? And then over time, perhaps you'll change and you have some kind of growth perspective. But this growth will always occur out of a fundament that stays the same, relatively speaking, right? And that's the idea of a stable core. And that's what I would say is sort of the narrative that we attempt to build, right? And I would postulate that this is entirely illusory, right? Like, the stability of the ego is on many levels illusory, right? Many things change all the time, but it's illusory even when we take into account the hypothesis of the unconscious, which essentially postulates that there is something within the ego that is a stranger to itself, right? And that thought in itself, I mean, something that is within you that is a stranger in itself, and I think it's beautifully illustrated by Jean-Luc Nancy, who told us of his heart transplant in one of his late essays, And he says that essentially it's a bizarre feeling to receive this transplant because it highlights the strangeness of the organs within you, within the body that you live in, right? Essentially the fact that you have in you a heart that beats, that nourishes your body, that provides the entire system that you exist through, that you call you, with the nutrition to exist, that this entire organ, this fundament of your being, if you will, physically speaking, is not yours. It's borrowed to a large, it's borrowed, if you will, but it's a stranger in itself, right? And that calls into question, I mean, a move that only a philosopher would make, calling into question. But then if that organ is a stranger, how do I know then that the other organs that I have within me, my lung, my liver, whatever, why would I consider those to be mine? And what does it even mean for an organ to be mine? And then you very quickly get down the road that I like to go down, saying, well, let's not stop with the organs. Why stop with the physical entities or physical elements of your body? Let's look at the psychological elements of the body, right? And consider, therefore, the entire psychological makeup or the entire psychological structure that you exist in, that you inhabit, a body, as much as we consider the physical body a body, right? And once we start making those, or start thinking along those trajectories, I think we get into the entire idea of the ego or the psyche, well, but the ego to the large extent structured as a narrative, right? And to specifically as a narrated body, because it's essentially a body that we tell stories about, and those stories are the kinds of stories that we think of, that we are, right? And this goes, of course, into the question, like, who are we, right? Like, who are you? Who are you, and how the hell you know who you are? And then when psychoanalysis comes in, it teaches us essentially that there's no way we know anything about that, about that me. What we know about that me is precisely what I just said, the story that I can construct about me, or tell about me, right? For Jung, that is part of the persona, although I would say the persona is a specific aspect of the ego, and the ego is essentially the story that I construct of myself as a whole. I always like to compare it to the photo library that we browse through when something's wrong, right? We do this all the time, and we do this all the time when the physical body is sick as well, right? If we remember the last time you had some kind of pain in your body, you're like, well, okay, well, I've been coughing for the last six weeks, but I don't really, you never really remember that it's been 6 weeks, by the way. That's another thing. I mean, we have this bias, and that's, research psychology has done many experiments on this, and we have these biases that essentially we don't really recall the duration of an illness. We don't really recall the past correctly longer than a certain amount of time, unless, especially when it comes to what I would call ego-threatening aspects of this history, right? And the health of your body is very ego-threatening, right? If your body breaks down, essentially the body is the fundament from which you venture into the unknown, right? So it's the fundament of what we would call the ego, and I would therefore, well, I suspect, and I don't know how many of you do this, and please go ahead and leave a comment, and let me know if you do this, or if you have experienced similar aspects. But I know this from myself, and there's significant research, at least in the realm of narrative psychology. And Susan Strang, for instance, she's done some research on cancer patients. But when you have an illness that maybe doesn't have to be a terminal illness, but it could be a flu, or it could even be an itch, or it could be a rash, or it could be let's say back pain, right? You'll immediately make up a story how it happened, right? You're like, well, actually, I forgot to put on my jacket when I went out the other day, or my kids are sick, that's why I get sick. You try to make up a story that essentially protects the more fundamental aspects of your own narrative, right? Of the kind of story that you've constructed about yourself. And the same happens psychologically, right? When you feel sad, right? You immediately go, well, okay, well, I feel so, well, this happened at work, and I'm tired because I didn't sleep well the last couple of nights, and so on and so forth. But so what you immediately attempt to do, and that's the kind of point I'm attempting to tease out, is you attempt to explain away the fact that there are aspects that you have no control over, and those aspects control you, to a large extent. And by you, I mean they control the ego that you've created a narrative about, that you think you have the power to control, but you actually don't, right? And that's the entire struggle, right, between the consciousness and the unconscious. And in the end, the split between unconscious and consciousness is essentially simply the split of letting go of the entirety of control that the ego attempts to have over everything all the time. And that's how I view the ego in its core, right? I mean, certainly I would recognize that that the personal unconscious is a part of the ego, right? Just, the shadow is a part of the ego for Jung. But when I speak of the ego, I speak of the sort of the core of the ego, which is this sort of which does not involve, which is, I would say, a function without any content. I would say the core of the ego, at least as I understand Jung, and please again correct me if I'm wrong and let me know in the comments, I would say the core of the ego is precisely the function that I just highlighted, namely the function narrate. The function to create this story that then enables you to go out into the world, interpret, and do all the kinds of things, essentially perform the hero's journey. And I would say that yes, on another level, you then have the unconscious forces, the shadow, and so on, pulling on the ego and subjugating that aim most importantly. And I would then say that, as you may have seen this, I've talked in other videos about the self as a rupturing force, and I would say it comes in precisely at this point, right? It comes in at the point where the ego attempts to sort of make these tyrannical gestures, these attempts to control reality, and says, "Wait, hold on. You don't have any control of reality, and here's why. You have the tick to always do something, and you attempt to override it, but you can't. Or you want to be a good mother, but you just keep beating your children, or you want to be a good lover, but you don't have any libido, or you want to be a good painter, but you just can't get yourself to paint." These kinds of interventions are essentially interventions of, I would say, objectivity, i.e. the self, via whatever it is in the personal unconscious that is repressed. But I think it's even difficult to think of the content as repressed here, and that's of course that's the field of tension that we must address. And essentially the field of tension is to what extent are the forces that intervene with the unfolding of the ego forces of an objective core that has previously been installed, so to speak, or that is sort of inborn, and to what extent are they formed in the lifetime of the ego itself. And of course, for Freud, I mean, and this is what I initially wanted to talk about in this video mostly. For Freud, the ego is essentially produced. The personal unconscious is produced by the ego, right? And that is the fundamental split, right? The unconscious is formed. It's a formation, and that's any creation of any sort creates or brings into being a repository of, let's say, non-creation, so a repository of something else, and that's the message, right? And attending that something else, right? If you think about this on the level of society, you could say, well, capitalism necessarily produces slavery, or the I can't recall the English term, but the I can't recall the term, but essentially the destruction of other countries, right? Um, right, you may say that, like Western wealth necessarily creates poverty in other parts of the world, right? And you may say that even the attempt to harmonize, I mean, that's the irony with the attempts to integrate any of these issues, right? Like, you'll always create a new third. Like, even if you bring about any kind of unity, if you integrate two opposites, right? Now let's say you attempt to integrate, or the West manages to integrate the collective guilt, or the in quotation marks, of slavery, right? Like, there is a third that will absolutely necessarily emerge. You can't integrate something without something else emerging. It simply doesn't work. And the question is, what's the consequence? What's the consequence if you go down that way, right? But you can't be blind to the necessity of consequence in any process of integration. It simply doesn't work. There's always a price to pay, if you will. And I think you have to be aware of that with in any kind of attempt to unify, right? The ego always attempts to unify, not because of heroic intentions, but because that gives the ego more control, and that simply creates another third always, and probably that's sort of the end note of the video as well, and I'd be curious if you could let me know again what if you would like me to go into aspects of this video in more depth. Like, I think this is a first venture into this kind of topic, and if you'd like me to talk about any aspects of it more, then let me know. But essentially, the idea that you cannot be reduced to yourself is inherent in all of psychoanalysis, and it's as inherent in Jung as it is in Freud, right? Like, even if we talk about the different aspects of the the different complexes that you can't integrate and so on, like I would never say or claim that the ego in Jung is at all coherent. It attempts to be coherent, yes, but it's not coherent. And I think that Freud's ego, as much as Jung's ego, attempts to be coherent. But I don't know that entirely. But it would be difficult for me to imagine an ego that's not attempting to be coherent, because you can't really move through the world without coherence. It doesn't really work. You can attempt to admit your non-coherence and attempt to venture into otherness, which is the Jungian quest, essentially, and probably the quest of all of psychoanalysis, for that matter. But it's impossible to exist without the illusion of coherence. You need the illusion, and that's essentially what the ego is. It's an illusion. Not in the Buddhist sense that the ego is nothing. I don't buy into that. But it's essentially it's an illusion in terms of its coherence and its control. Right. I hope that makes sense, and thanks for watching if you're still tuned in or listening. And again, please do let me know what else you want to hear me discuss in more depth, or if you have any book that you would like to cover. And give this video a thumbs up, and don't forget to subscribe. Thanks a lot. Bye bye.